Welcome to EA Global San Francisco. Yeah, how about that? It's after 10 o'clock, guys. Give us a little energy. We're getting a little bit of a late start, so I will keep my remarks real quick. We've got those long breaks, as you know, so we'll be able to make up some time throughout the day. But super excited to be here at the Innovation Hangar in San Francisco, right around the way from the Palace of Fine Arts. In preparation for this event, I was thinking back to my very first trip to San Francisco 8 years ago. It was for the Singularity Summit 2009, and it was held just around the way, literally on this plot of land. And it really is no exaggeration 8 years later to say that that event changed my life. The theme of today's event is doing good together. And when I think back on that event, what I think about most are all the people that I met. Some of them have become my best friends. Some of them have become the biggest influences on my thinking philosophically. And we are all doing very different things, but all very mindful of how we can impact the world in a distributed way together. So I hope that over the next 2 days, with all of the great things going on, all of the great speakers, all of the great workshops, that each of you has an experience similar to what I had 8 years ago, and that years from now, you can look back on this event and say that it changed your life and that it brought you into a mode of thinking or helped you enter a mode of thinking about how to do good as part of this great community. To kick the event off today, as we often do, we've got Professor Will MacAskill. He is an associate professor in philosophy at Oxford University. He was educated at Cambridge, Princeton, and Oxford. He is one of the progenitors of the EA movement. His book on the topic, Doing Good Better, was published in 2015 and reviewed positively in the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, The Guardian, and the New York Times. He is a co-founder of 3 nonprofits based on EA principles, Giving What We Can, which was founded in 2009, 80,000 Hours, founded in 2011, and the Center for Effective Altruism, founded in 2012. 2 of those organizations have gone through Y Combinator. They have collectively raised over $30 million for effective charities, and a further $1.4 billion has been pledged in lifetime commitments. They have also changed the career paths of thousands of individuals around the world. Will has written for The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Independent, Time, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. He's given dozens of public lectures. He is a regular in the media. He has even been an advisor to number 10 Downing Street and former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. His research focuses on how one ought to make decisions given moral uncertainty. He is a Forbes 30 Under 30 social entrepreneur and World Economic Forum Young Global Shaper. Today, he will speak about doing good together. Please join me in welcoming Professor Will MacAskill.
Hello, EA Global, San Francisco 2017. Hey! Yeah, I'm glad that people now start waving at me personally, which is exactly in keeping with the theme of this event, which is community-focused. The event's about how can we as a community do good together. And Nathan spoke very eloquently about how the Effective Altruism community can be this amazing source of kind of meaning in your life, source of friendships, source of some of the closest connections and influences that we can have. And so the kind of reason we focused on this as a topic is because the EA community is growing, just more and more people getting involved. We've now got thousands of bright, committed people all around the world. And that poses some new challenges. So in the early days of effective altruism, if you wanted to do as much good as possible, you could just ask, how can I as an individual do as much good as I can? You didn't really need to think about the actions of other people, at least not very much. But that's now very different. Now, because there's thousands of people all around the world, we have the potential to do much more good acting in unison as a community than we can if we're just acting as the sum total of a number of individual actors. In just the same way as companies can benefit from economies of scale, or as networks benefit massively from economies of scale, with one law estimate suggesting the value of a network is not linear with the number of its members, but varies with the square of the number of its members. Can we act as more like a network and a community to make the impact of the whole much greater than the impact of the sum of our parts? So that's why we're trying to encourage people to move from thinking about the question of how can I do the most good to the question of how can we do the most good. So in the spirit of this being a community event, I want everyone to turn to someone nearby to them that they haven't met before, preferably, and introduce yourself, say what you do, how you got involved with effective altruism. Okay, I'm going to now interrupt you again. I was kind of tempted to just be like, this was the talk, and now I'm going to walk off stage. This is definitely the core of the ideas, getting everyone talking. Okay, terrific. I really hated to interrupt that. That was so nice to see. But I'm going to talk at least a little bit about the kind of theory of why this idea, like how thinking about doing good as a community differs from doing good as individuals. And so we can make a distinction between kind of three different types of community. The first is what I'll call a single-player community. That's where everyone in this group just thinks as individuals. They're making decisions about how can they have an impact that's independent of how everyone else is acting. So like we said, that's asking, how can I as an individual do the most good? Second type of community is what I'm going to call a market community. That's what economists normally represent things as being like. And it's probably most what the community of, say, the United States or San Francisco is like. That's where you've got a large group of people, and they all have different aims, conflicting aims. In general, maybe they're all acting out of their own self-interest. They want to benefit themselves. And that can be really powerful still. People can engage in trade. You can have various forms of coordination that mean that everyone benefits. But because everyone has different aims, there's always going to be a kind of tit-for-tat element. If I help someone else out, it's because I think I can get something else in return, or because I know I'm going to get something else in return. And then finally, there's a shared aims community. So even though the market community is very well studied by economists, shared aims community is a little bit different. In this sort of community, everyone has the same goal. And what's really interesting and exciting there is that in shared aims communities, you have the potential to have radically greater levels of cooperation and unity of action than you do in certainly the single-player community, but even the market sort of community as well. And effective altruism is to a very significant extent like this kind of shared aims community. We're all aiming to do as much good as we can using evidence and reason to figure out how to do so. And that has like interesting results. So it means, for example, the idea of trade doesn't actually make sense. So if I have a laptop and I think, oh, someone else will be able to use that laptop to do more good, then I'm like, here, have it. If you're actually going to be able to use that to make the world a better place, then you should just take it. And I don't expect anything in return because I'm helping to achieve my own goals by doing that. And we actually do have examples of that happening in the community already. Things like someone who is wanting to, say, retrain as a programmer in order to go and earn to give. I know of a case where someone else in the community said, OK, cool, that's a great idea that you should do that. You're currently bottlenecked by money. Just have some funding. That means you can then pursue this boot camp for the next few months. Without asking for anything in return. It wasn't a loan. It's just, I think you're going to be able to use this money in a better way than I could if I spent it on myself. And that's extremely powerful. Similarly, in shared aims communities, if you've got everyone with the same aim, certain sorts of problems, like prisoners' dilemmas, where you can get tragedies of the commons because no one wants to cooperate, they actually just don't arise. If everyone cares as much about other people having an impact as themselves, then you can't defect in prisoners' dilemmas. That just doesn't make sense. And so I'm going to talk in a little bit. I'll mention how in some ways we still are like a market community. But assuming we are like a shared aims community, which I think is to a significant extent true, what does that mean for how we ought to think and what we ought to do? And I think it means a few things. And these become more and more important the larger the community grows. And I think it's really important for us to get this right now while the community is still relatively small, still perhaps numbering in the thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, because this kind of getting the right culture, the right set of norms is going to become incredibly important when we are much larger. And so there's kind of 4 different things I'm going to want to talk about in this talk. So taking a portfolio approach to career choice rather than what I was calling a single-player approach, taking externalities very seriously of your actions, moral trade, and then character traits as well. And I'll go through each of these. So here's an example to illustrate the portfolio approach to career choice. And this harks back to 2011. It's actually a bit of an idealized example. It's kind of simplified, but it's to make a certain point. So Ben Todd and Matt Waggy were just about to graduate in each case, and they were thinking about what careers should they pursue. And they both had good options, it seemed, for doing direct work or for earning to give. And it was the case that if Matt did earning to give, the best thing for Ben to do was to do direct work. And if Ben did earning to give, then the best thing for Matt to do was direct work. And so I've represented this in a table where the numbers just represent the kind of total value they're generating to the world. Again, you might have seen similar tables in game theory setups, and normally you've got the utilities for each person. This is a shared aims community, so you just need to look at total value. Now, what was interesting, though, was that Ben was actually better than Matt, comparatively better than Matt at direct work. And Matt was comparatively better than Ben at earning to give. He had higher earning potential. Yet at one point, it looked like Matt was going to go into direct work and Ben was going to go into earning to give. Because if you look at this table, supposing Ben believes that Matt's going to go into direct work, it's still the best thing for him to do to earn to give, even though the best outcome is one in which Matt's earning to give and Ben's doing direct work. So this is known as a stag hunt problem. It's a kind of coordination problem from game theory. And in this case, it was OK. Matt and Ben could communicate. We could say, OK, well, this doesn't make any sense if if Matt's doing direct work and Ben's earning to give. That's kind of a suboptimal way of distributing our careers. Instead, we should switch. In a larger community, though, you can't communicate in that sort of way. So instead, we need to build in a sort of culture where we acknowledge that there's potentially coordination problems like this. Instead, then, of thinking, well, how do I, as an individual, do as much good, which might mean that you end up as a community with a kind of suboptimal allocation of people in different careers. Instead, what we should think is, how can I move the effective altruism community closer to the ideal portfolio of careers, where the ideal portfolio of things that different people are pursuing in the EA community might look actually very different from what things would look like if everyone was pursuing their own paths, but thinking independently, not thinking about other people. And so then let's return to this example and just show how this way of thinking would work in this particular case. So now, supposing Ben and Matt can't communicate, because they're on different sides of the world, it's a big community, and so on. And Ben is wondering, OK, well, what ought I to do? Well, if we have this norm in the community of thinking what we all do is not what's best just from my perspective, but what's best from the community's perspective, what's the optimal portfolio, Ben can think, aha, I know that Matt is going to do the thing which plays to his comparative advantage. Matt's not going to do direct work because we both know that the optimal allocation, when considered as a community, is Ben doing direct work and Matt earning to give. So if we have a norm in the community where people are thinking, well, what's the optimal portfolio of careers across the community, then you don't even need communication in order to solve coordination problems like this. Because you know that everyone's going to try and aim for the optimal portfolio. And so in this case, Matt would earn to give, and Ben would do direct work, even if they weren't communicating, as long as we had that kind of shared cultural understanding. So what else does this mean? I think a really big thing that it means is rather than everyone building general purpose skills, it might be better for almost everyone to build specialist skills. So, this is what happens again if you think about a small company versus a big company. At the very early stages of a startup, just a few people, everyone is kind of doing everything. You've maybe got a little bit of specialization, but people are doing sales and marketing and coding and finance kind of all at once. But as an organization grows, that no longer becomes very efficient. Instead, you want to benefit from division of labor. People start focusing on individual things. And so then the worry if people are pursuing the single-player approach is that everyone goes and builds kind of general career capital. So, perhaps everyone goes into consulting or something where they think, this is good for a wide variety of paths, and I want to be really open to a lot of paths. And I think that really made sense in the early stages of the community. And I think it makes a lot less sense now. And instead, what can be the case is that we should have instead people really trying to level up in lots of different specialties. And then the whole community can benefit from that kind of expertise in that particular area. As a wise man once said, if you don't have a comparative advantage, you should go and get one. That wise man wasn't me, although I was referencing Tyrion Lannister there. And a kind of second way in which a second kind of reason for thinking this as well is because the community is larger, it means we can take more bets. Because in the kind of small community, we might want to prove to ourselves. We think we've got this powerful way of looking at the world. We want to show, yeah, this can really lead to some big impacts. Which then have kind of flow-on effects of helping to grow the community and so on. And that means you want to maybe aim for sure bets, like definite ways of doing good. Whereas if you have lots and lots of people all aiming to pursue career paths that are maybe higher risk but higher reward, you at least get a guarantee that some people are going to have those really big successes, and therefore it kind of has the benefit of proving the sort of impact we can have as a community, even if that means that 9 times out of 10 the path that people have pursued hasn't worked out, but that 1 time in 10 it's been a really big win. And there's definitely a worry with this idea of effective altruism. How can I optimize? How can I do as much good as possible? That means that people won't want to kind of take bets as much in their career because they think, well, what if it doesn't pan out? People are going to judge me. People are going to think that I'm not doing the best thing. And so again, as a matter of culture, I think it's going to be really important that we really cultivate the idea that people can be rewarded for just going and really pursuing something in depth, even if it ends up not working out. And so then, in terms of the community as it stands at the moment, I think there's some skills that are potential. Like, again, what you could be thinking about in terms of your career is what are the skills that are really underrepresented in the movement, rather than necessarily what are the skills that, from an abstract perspective, are the most important. And I think things operations management, certainly policy and marketing are some skills that are currently quite underrepresented. Areas of knowledge, I think, biology, economics, history, politics. And it might be that you'd think, if you're just thinking from yourself, what are the most important skills to learn, or what are the most important areas of knowledge to learn, you wouldn't think of these areas. But if we have lots of people who are already philosophers, say, probably far more philosophers than any community ever needs, maybe it's not the best thing to be going into that, even if you thought, don't know why, bizarrely, that philosophy was the best thing, all things considered. No, I do think philosophy is important. I shouldn't diss it. So that's thinking about the kind of portfolio approach. And obviously, it's hard to know kind of what is the optimal allocation, but organizations like 80,000 Hours that you can talk to can start to help you to answer that question because they've got more of a lay of the land. So a second, I think, really important thing when we're thinking about what does doing good in a community kind of look like compared to doing good as individuals? It's the idea of externalities. So there's impacts that you have on the rest of the community that are kind of like a side benefit of something that you're trying to do anyway. And I think there's a number of these. So one is value of information. If you pursue some career path, for example, and say no one's done it, really kind of pursued it before, and then you kind of write up about this idea, kind of tell the community about what you've learned, anyone can then read that and learn from that. And as the community gets larger and larger, the benefits of sharing that information get greater and greater. Because if you've discovered some new amazing way of doing good, then everyone can kind of see that. And the larger the community is, the more people that can benefit. And so I think that becomes really important. And I'll talk a bit more about that at length in the closing talk as well. And then similarly, new ideas as well. But this is value of information might be exploring different career paths, new ideas, thinking about actually doing research and coming up with new ideas, maybe ways in which the EA community is making a mistake at the moment, new cause areas, new means of having an impact. Again, now that we've got a larger community, this has got this huge externality. You're doing this, and the benefits are gained by the entire community. You're potentially moving a much larger number of people and actions. I think similarly, just actually doing and things that are very impressive now has this large kind of benefit for the whole community. Insofar as if we do something and it's, wow, this is just this amazing thing that's come out of the effective altruism community, one benefit that you've got is not just obviously the large benefits you've provided yourself, but also you're kind of acting as a representative of the EA community in general. And it's possible that these sorts of benefits can actually be larger than the benefits of the actions you're taking. I mean, one case that I think is particularly impressive is charity science, running these fundraising, thinking, okay, the best thing we can do is fundraising. So we're really going to go into fundraising for Give World Top charities as hard as we can, try and raise as much money as we can. And then what they did was write up, in an incredibly transparent and helpful way, the results of the experiment all the way through. And they ultimately concluded, actually, this just didn't work. It wasn't as good as we were expecting from the outset. And it's quite plausible that just the value of that bit of information, we tried this thing and it didn't work out, is much larger than the benefits that they got from the money that they raised to charity. And I think we could potentially be doing that a lot more. Then the final case, not technically an externality, because it actually imposes a little bit of a cost on you, but somewhat similar because it's taking the kind of stockpile of resources or value you've created and then trying to share it as much as possible. It's just this idea of 5-minute favors. And I think this is incredibly powerful, where each of us carries around with us a set of people we know, of opportunities we know about, of ideas we have. And in a community, we can meet someone else and think, oh, wow, I have something that this other person can really benefit from, and maybe vice versa. And again, in a single-player community, we wouldn't really be thinking about that as a benefit. In a market community, you have to say, oh, well, how is this person going to benefit me? What can I get in return? Means you're maybe not going to get that many trades. Shared aims community is great. You can just say, hey, yeah, I've got this person you should definitely consider hiring that I know of. You should definitely be looking into this, or I have some amount of funding, or this connection I want to make with you. And again, we don't need to think about anything in return because we've all got the same aim. And so I'm going to take another little pause in the talk to say, of this person that you introduced yourself to right at the very beginning of the talk, now talk to them again just for 2 minutes and ask them, how can I help you? Is there any easy way in which I can provide value to you in terms of your aims towards making the world better? So I'll give you 2 minutes to do that. I really hate to break into such nice conversations, but in the interest of time, I'll have to let you continue this after the break. It's maybe a futile effort to stop EAs helping each other. See, all my jokes are getting lost in the people in the back. Just so engrossed in community impact. Okay, thanks, and sorry to have to interrupt that. Again, it was beautiful seeing you all cooperate like that. So, okay, we talked. I really hope that was already like providing some value. Hopefully, it maybe even gave you a sense as well of just actually how much potential there is to work together as a community. So I'll briefly talk just some more about some of the possible things in which thinking as a community really changes the way you should kind of think about having an impact. Because I talked about positive externalities, there's obviously negative externalities as well. Things that you could do that have a bad effect on the reputation of effective altruism, for example. Because now, now that EA is getting bigger, if you interact with someone on Facebook or in person, and you're a jerk, the other person's probably not going to think, wow, that person's a jerk. They're probably going to think, wow, EAs are jerks. Because it's in those sorts of stereotypes that people naturally think. And again, that can, has an effect on the entire movement. The larger the community is, the bigger the costs there. Similarly, being contributing to a bad culture as well. If people feel like this is hostile or unwelcoming, or people can't air unorthodox ideas, that's both bad in and of itself, means that people are going to, but also then means that there's going to be second-order effects of people just talking less in public, which then removes this positive externality, like we were talking about with charity science, or as GiveWell and Open Phil have done, of very openly spreading ideas for the benefit of everyone. And so that means that getting this kind of culture right of being very welcoming to new ideas, and making people feel like empowered when they come into the community, becomes just very important indeed. So I talked at the moment about how we're kind of like a shared aims community. This isn't completely right. We're kind of in between, because inevitably people are going to disagree. And I think in a large community, that's even a kind of good thing. Again, from the single player epistemology, everyone's just, what's the optimal thing or correct thing for me to believe? As we start to get a larger community, it might be the case that actually having some amount of disagreement is really good. In the same way in science, you have people who just start defending their views and are probably overconfident in their own views. But as a social matter, you make more progress from the scientific community as a whole for many people defending particular viewpoints and kind of acting as representatives for those viewpoints. So we're probably going to have some disagreement, maybe about how things are going to pan out, or about values, and those might turn into cause disagreements. And so that means to some extent we still will have differences in kind of what we're trying to achieve, though certainly much smaller than the differences in a typical market community. And so in those cases, the concept of trade does still make sense. And Toby Ord, my colleague at Oxford, came up with this idea of moral trade, the fact that in just the same way I can trade goods and services, we can trade kind of moral actions or moral commitments. And you might think their specific trades are like, if I think charity A is the best and you think charity C is the best, and we both think charity B is really pretty good but not our best option, well, maybe we should collaborate and both donate to charity B. That's an example of a moral trade. Or if I say, well, I'll offset my carbon emissions if you go vegetarian or something. Those would be particular examples of trade. And I think that's really interesting, but I think the even more interesting idea of moral trade is kind of what I'd call open-ended trades, which again is where, this is a community, and even when we differ, we really want to help each other out as much as possible. And that means as a culture and a community, I'm going to provide you things, and I don't expect anything kind of immediately in return, but over the long run, I think if we're all doing this, we're all going to benefit. And this is something that already happens a lot in EA, and I think is really terrific. So things like, a new donor comes into the community, normal organization would want to protect that donor, only get the funding for me. Whereas that's not what happens. It's normally like, oh, cool, I'll introduce you to all these other great organizations. And maybe I still think my organization is the highest impact, but as a kind of norm in the community, I want to ensure that this person gets to see as much of the community as possible. And similarly for sharing potential job opportunities, or if new people come in and want to work for an EA organization, again, ensuring that they can meet as many of the different organizations as possible. And this idea of kind of favors for people as well, where even if you do have slightly different views on how best to do as much good as possible, again, having this culture and community where people are helping out each other as much as possible is going to make everyone much better at achieving their goals. Then the final implication, I think, of thinking like a community rather than as individuals is that it becomes much more important to start following kind of more predictable rules or cultivating character traits that are more predictable rather than trying to assess every single decision on a case-by-case basis. Where, if you think, okay, I'm an EA, so I take really seriously my career path, and this is this huge decision, and I'm always updating in the light of new evidence, so I just think about what career should I pursue kind of every single week. Like every Sunday morning, this is what I do. I mean, firstly, it's going to be really stressful, and so that's not a good thing. But then secondly, it just will make you less attractive as an employee, because now it's not the case that the employer can say, okay, I can just bank on this person being around for quite a long time. Instead, there's like constant uncertainty, and that makes certain sorts of coordination much harder. When it comes to working at other organizations, also can just be surprising for people and, again, potentially contribute to bad reputation. We've definitely had one company where there's a bit of a reputation of kind of EAs being flaky, precisely for this reason of just, they're constantly thinking what's the best thing to do, and so then maybe switch out of their career path earlier than would have, common sense kind of would have suggested. An analogy for this is kind of like a thermostat, where if you have a thermostat that just says, above 20 degrees Celsius, I'll raise the temperature, decrease the temperature below, I'll raise above, then when you get to the kind of borderline, it just flicks back and forth like this. And so thermostats have a kind of built-in lag so that that doesn't happen. Maybe they decrease the temperature to 21, increase it to 19. And I think there's a similar idea here in terms of the rules we cultivate, where once we set a plan, we kind of stick to it and are happy to stick to it, even if we start to worry maybe it's not the optimal thing, because that helps so much with coordination. And similarly, things like, oh, I'm an EA, therefore I don't think about saying things that are true, I think about saying things that are optimal for the world. That's like really bad as a community norm. Thankfully, I've never heard anyone actually suggest this, but it's a sort of risk that you could have, because it's really important from coordination purposes that if someone says something, you can accept it's going to be true. And I think probably we should value traits like honesty, and for the very similar reasons, commitment to promises, even more highly than common sense. So I think a lot of these rules and character traits do make even more outcome-oriented consequentialist thinking more like common sense kind of morality in some ways. I think in some cases they can actually go even further in that direction. And I think that's definitely true with respect to honesty. Other rules I think are important are if you think you are in a situation like prisoner's dilemma or unilateralist curse, where there's some risk of just someone charging forward with a particular plan, even if other people don't think it's a good one, having very strong kind of cooperative norms, I think, are going to be really important there. And then also just treating other people's views with respect, where I do think we have this kind of social epistemology benefit of lots of different people pursuing different lines of inquiry. That means we want to be kind of very welcoming and opening to people who have different perspectives and views, even if you think those views sound totally dumb, still being able to treat them with respect. And I think all of this is especially true as the community grows larger. More and more of the interaction is going to happen online, using media like Twitter and Facebook, where these have been set up in order to create drama, because that means that people will want to kind of keep going back to them. And it's particularly easy to misrepresent other people or be uncharitable or unwelcoming. So I think we've with a largely online community, we've got to go even further in this direction. Okay, and then this all kind of comes into something we developed over the last year, which is CEA's guiding values for effective altruism. So as well as a definition of effective altruism, using evidence and reason to benefit others by as much as possible, also a set of values that help to kind of define the community. And the first three of these should just be familiar from the single-player approach. Commitment to others, we want to benefit others, of course. We've got a scientific mindset, we're thinking about reason and evidence, of course. Openness, we're trying to pursue any different cause, we're not fixed in our ways of doing good. Again, these are kind of core ideas of the single-player approach. But now as we're thinking about a community, these latter two become even more important. Like the idea of integrity, we act with honesty and transparency and stick to promises or commitments if we've made them. It becomes extremely important as a community. Collaborative spirit as well, the idea that I'll hinder my own plans a little bit or take a little bit of time out in order to help other people as well. These two values make a lot more sense when we're thinking about it as a community. And so these are the ones that I really want to highlight for the purpose of this conference. Okay, so as a kind of recap, in terms of what we can do and what you can be thinking about over the course of this conference. So taking a portfolio approach to career choice thinking in the landscape of EA at the moment, what's currently neglected, and can I help fill that in? And even if there's kind of general recommendations coming about careers paths, thinking, well, how does this apply to the particular situation, and relying on the EA mindset. Then related to that, thinking, well, can I gain exploration value or that value of information by exploring certain paths, things that EAs don't really know about very much at the moment, and then writing up the results of that experiment or test for the benefit of everyone. Then I think also in terms of kind of values we embody, thinking, okay, I'm going to take very seriously the idea that I am now acting as a representative of this much larger community. And that means I want to act in such a way that if someone saw me and thought this is what EAs are like, that they have a very positive impression. And then within the community being extremely considerate, extremely helpful to each other, and constantly, therefore, embodying the idea of acting with integrity, acting with collaborative spirit, as well as living up to the other core values of commitment to others, scientific mindset, and openness. And so if there's just one thing, though, that I want to use this conference, it's that little experiment I gave just a few minutes ago of just when you meet someone, first question you might ask could be, how can I help you? What are the current bottlenecks or things that you're lacking in terms of your pursuit of trying to do good? What are the ways I can be as helpful as possible in terms of helping you to do more good? And I think that if we do manage to foster this culture where we think, we are trying to act and have impact as a community rather than merely as a collection of individuals, well, I think that gives us the potential to do radically more good. Okay, thank you.